Most places go quiet after a disaster. The noise fades, the wreckage is cleared, and eventually people leave. Pearl Harbor didn't. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the attack ended in hours. The planes were gone, the explosions stopped, but the harbor remained full. Ships burned at anchor, oil spread across the water, steel hulls settled into the harbor floor. Inside some of them, men never made it out. In most wars, there is a pause after loss, a moment where the fighting stops and recovery begins. Pearl Harbor didn't have that moment. The port stayed open. Salvage began almost immediately. Fuel was pumped out. Ships were raised, repaired, or sealed where they lay. Work continued while the dead were still there. And that decision, to keep the harbor functioning, shaped everything that followed. For decades afterward, Pearl Harbor remained active. Ships came and went. New generations worked the same docks. But among those who spent long nights there, alone, something persisted. Not stories passed down, not legends told to scare. Experiences. Sounds that didn't fit, places that felt heavier than they should. Areas quietly avoided without explanation. No official reports, no investigations, just patterns. This is not a story about ghosts. It's a story about what happens when a place is never allowed to stop, when systems move on faster than people can, about a port that absorbed loss and kept working, and about what remains when closure is postponed indefinitely. This is the story of Pearl Harbor, not as a battle, but as a place that never truly went quiet. And this is Port 13. Let's begin. When the attack ended, the damage was already final. Battleships lay sunk at anchor, their hulls torn open, their decks partially submerged. Some had capsized completely, others settled unevenly into the mud of the harbor floor. Inside them, the steel had become a trap. Sailors were sealed into compartments by fire, flooding, and twisted bulkheads. Some survived the initial explosions, some survived the sinking. They waited in darkness. Rescue crews worked as quickly as they could, cutting through steel, listening for sound. Knocking was heard in several wrecks, faint, rhythmic, unmistakably human. A few men were pulled out alive. Many were not. As hours turned into days, the chances disappeared. Flooded compartments filled completely. Air ran out. Silence followed. Recovery was incomplete from the beginning. Some bodies could not be reached without dismantling entire sections of ships. Others were never located at all. The harbor floor became a grave, not by design, but by necessity. And then something unusual happened. The port reopened, not after full recovery, not after the wrecks were cleared, not after the dead were removed. Work resumed while ships still rested beneath the surface. Salvage operations began alongside normal harbor activity. Fuel was pumped out, debris was cleared where it interfered with operations. But many wrecks remained exactly where they sunk, sealed, documented, left in place. The war did not allow time for closure. Pearl Harbor was too important to stop, too central to the Pacific War to wait. So the harbor became two things at once: a functioning military port and a resting place for men who never left their ships. Above the water, cranes moved, supplies arrived, sailors reported for duty. Below the surface, steel compartments remained untouched. The port continued to operate with the dead still inside it. And from that moment on, Pearl Harbor was never just a harbor again. It was a place where the war moved forward without fully leaving its losses behind. The recovery did not wait for grief. Within hours, Pearl Harbor shifted from rescue to salvage. Not because the loss was small, but because the port was too important to stop. Fuel still burned on the surface. Oil coated the water in thick, dark layers. If it wasn't removed quickly, it would poison the harbor for months. So pumps were lowered into the wrecks. Fuel was drawn out of shattered tanks. Debris was cleared only where it interfered with movement. The goal was not restoration. It was functionality. Some ships were raised slowly, section by section. Others were dismantled where they lay. Steel was cut away, compartments opened, bulkheads removed. And sometimes, during that work, human remains were found. There was no ceremony when it happened, no announcement. Work paused briefly, the remains were removed, and the operation continued. This was not cruelty, it was urgency. The Pacific War was expanding. Ships were needed, time was limited. Pearl Harbor could not afford to become a memorial, so it became a workspace layered over loss. Cranes moved above decks that had once been living spaces. Divers worked inside hulls that had become graves. Machinery ran where men had died only days before. There was no mourning period, no moment where the harbor emptied itself, because stopping would have meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was not allowed. The port was repaired while the damage was still fresh. It functioned while the memory was unresolved. From the outside, Pearl Harbor looked like recovery. From below the waterline, it looked unfinished. And that unfinished state, work continuing over wreckage, routine built on top of loss, would shape how the harbor was experienced for decades to come. The earliest reports did not come from visitors. They came from people whose job was to stay after everyone else had gone. Night guards walking long patrol routes, dock workers assigned to late shifts, maintenance crews working alone near the waterline. They did not describe panic. They did not describe fear. They described interruption. Voices heard where no one was scheduled to be. Not shouting, not clear words, just the sound of conversation, distant, indistinct, stopping when approached. At some piers, guards reported knocking sounds coming from the water. Not metallic impacts, not the rhythmic creak of ships settling. Irregular, hollow, out of place. Footsteps were heard on walkways long after operations had ended. Slow, measured, as if someone was moving with purpose. When checked, the walkways were empty. What made these reports unusual was not their intensity, it was their consistency. Different men, different shifts, different years, the same descriptions. No one claimed to see figures, no one spoke of apparitions. The experiences were sensory, not visual. And they were never reported formally. In a working military port, unexplained sounds were expected to have explanations. Machinery cools, steel contracts, water carries noise in strange ways. Most workers accepted this, but some noticed something else. The sounds did not occur everywhere, they clustered. Certain piers, specific dry docks, areas close to wrecks that had never been fully cleared, places where ships had sunk at anchor, where compartments had been sealed rather than emptied. These patterns were never written down. They passed quietly from one shift to another, as warnings, as habits. People learned which routes felt longer than they should, which sections of the port felt heavier at night. Not frightening, just wrong. It wasn't one story, it was many, independent, uncoordinated, and repeated often enough that no single explanation ever fully erased them. And that repetition, quiet, persistent, unaddressed, is what made the port feel different after dark. Not because something was seen, but because something was heard again and again where nothing should have been at all. Over time, the reports began to do something subtle. They repeated themselves, not in stories told loudly, not in warnings posted on walls, in behavior. Certain docks became difficult to staff on night shifts, not because anyone said they were dangerous, but because guards asked quietly to be assigned elsewhere. No reasons were given. Requests were brief, matter of fact. I'd rather take another route. Some dry docks saw crews rotated more often than usual, assignments shortened, tasks completed quickly and without delay. Supervisors noticed the pattern before they heard any explanation. Workers asked for transfers away from specific areas, not immediately, not dramatically, after weeks, after months. When asked why, most didn't answer directly. They said the area felt uncomfortable, that concentration was difficult, that time seemed to stretch in ways they couldn't explain. No one used the word haunted. What made this difficult to dismiss was consistency. New personnel, unaware of earlier reports, reacted the same way. They avoided the same walkways, the same piers, the same stretches of water. These were not the most damaged areas, not the loudest, not the most dangerous by regulation. They were simply the places closest to wrecks that had never been fully cleared, ships sealed rather than emptied, compartments documented and left alone. The locations appeared again and again, across years, across shifts, across people who had never spoken to each other. There was no single incident that explained it, no event that could be isolated and investigated, just a pattern. And patterns are harder to ignore than rumors, because rumors spread quickly. Patterns take time. By the time the pattern became visible, it was already embedded in how the port was worked. Routes adjusted, assignments shifted, certain places were passed through, not lingered in. The port never acknowledged this officially, but it adapted, quietly. The same way people do when something cannot be explained, but also cannot be ignored. And that quiet adaptation, people changing their behavior without ever saying why, became another layer in a harbor already built on unresolved loss. The U.S. Navy never issued statements about the reports, not because they were sensational, but because acknowledging them served no operational purpose. Pearl Harbor was not a memorial site. It was an active military installation. Readiness mattered more than reflection. Continuity mattered more than memory. Anything that threatened morale, discipline, or confidence in the base was treated as a risk. Unexplained experiences fell into that category. Reports of voices, knocking, or footsteps were not encouraged. They were not officially investigated, and they were not formally denied. Instead, they were redirected. If a sound could be explained as mechanical, it was. If it could be blamed on fatigue, it was. If it could not be explained at all, it was quietly ignored. Some incidents were noted informally, mentioned in conversations, shift logs, or personal accounts, but they were never elevated. There would be no memos, no inquiries, no conclusions. Acknowledgement itself was seen as a liability. To admit that a place carried unresolved weight would invite questions the Navy could not answer, and could not afford to entertain during wartime or afterward. Ports exist to function. They are not designed to pause, reflect, or process loss. Pearl Harbor, especially, could not be allowed to feel unfinished. So the official position became silence, not denial, not explanation, absence. And that absence had an effect. Without acknowledgement, the experiences did not disappear. They simply remained unspoken, passed quietly between workers, avoided rather than addressed. The Navy maintained control of the harbor, but control of the narrative was easier than control of what people felt during long night shifts, alone, surrounded by steel and water. Silence became policy, and policy ensured the port continued operating, even if something about it never quite settled. Long after the war, historians and psychologists began looking at places like Pearl Harbor differently, not to prove ghosts, but to understand why certain environments never feel empty. Pearl Harbor experienced sudden, violent mass death. Hundreds of men died without warning, many trapped in confined steel spaces. There was no gradual retreat, no evacuation. Death arrived instantly and unevenly. That matters. Studies of trauma show that places where death is sudden and unresolved often carry long-term psychological weight, especially when normal activity resumes immediately afterward. Pearl Harbor did not pause. Salvage crews worked days after the attack. Guards patrolled at night. Maintenance continued while wrecks remained beneath the water. There was no clear separation between disaster and routine. The environment itself added to this effect. Steel ships amplify sound. Bulkheads carry vibration. Water bends and redirects noise in unpredictable ways. A footstep can travel farther than expected. A distant impact can sound close. A mechanical shift can resemble something human. Now add isolation. Night shifts, long patrol routes, minimal lighting, hours without conversation. In those conditions, the human brain does what it has always done. It looks for patterns. Silence becomes noticeable. Small sounds become meaningful. Absence becomes presence. This does not mean the experiences were imagined. It means the environment encouraged repetition. When multiple people across years report similar sensations in the same locations, psychologists look less at belief and more at conditions. Unresolved trauma, repetitive space, continual function without closure. Pearl Harbor was not allowed to rest, and places that are never allowed to rest often retain a sense of tension, not because something supernatural remains, but because something human was never fully processed. Historians do not deny the experiences reported at Pearl Harbor. They contextualize them. They point out that war leaves impressions not only on people, but on places where people were lost and never fully recovered. In that sense, Pearl Harbor is not unique, but it is extreme. A working grave layered beneath daily routine. Steel above, water below, and memory caught somewhere in between. When the war ended, many places were allowed to stop. Battlefields emptied, camps closed, front lines dissolved into memory. Pearl Harbor did not. The Pacific War concluded, ships returned home, the emergency passed. But the harbor remained active. New vessels arrived, old ones were retired, generations of sailors rotated through the same piers. The base evolved, modernized, expanded. What it did not do was pause. Memorials were eventually built, ceremonies were held, names were engraved in stone. But these moments existed alongside daily operations, not in place of them. Cranes still moved. Fuel still flowed. Patrols still walked the docks at night. The wrecks beneath the water remained, some marked, some raised, some left exactly where they had sunk. There was no moment when the harbor emptied itself of the past. Unlike a battlefield, a port cannot be abandoned. Its purpose is continuity. So Pearl Harbor carried its history forward while remaining in use. The same steel piers served different wars, different uniforms, different missions. But the physical space never reset. And that mattered, because places that are never allowed to rest do not process loss the way abandoned places do. Memory becomes layered instead of released. Routine settles on top of unresolved events. The harbor did not hold on to the past deliberately. It simply never let it go. And for those who worked there, especially at night, That continuity was felt, not as fear, not as spectacle, but as presence, a sense that the harbor was still occupied by more than just ships, not because something remained visible, but because nothing was ever truly finished. The war ended, the base continued, and Pearl Harbor remained what it had become during those hours in December, a place where function outpaced closure, a port that was never allowed to rest. When people describe Pearl Harbor as haunted, they are not talking about ghosts. There are no figures moving through the fog, no apparitions walking the docks. What they are describing is something quieter, a place shaped by unresolved death that was never given time to stop. Pearl Harbor absorbed sudden loss on a massive scale. Men died without warning. Many were never recovered, and the harbor continued to operate almost immediately. That combination matters. In most disasters, activity stops. People leave. Silence follows. Here, function resumed before closure could begin. Ships docked. Fuel flowed. Work continued. Death was acknowledged later, but not at the moment it occurred. The harbor never had a chance to reset, so what remained was not legend, but continuity layered over loss. People did not report seeing things. They reported feeling something. A weight, an unease, a sense that the space carried more than its visible purpose. This is what historians mean when they talk about places being haunted, not by spirits, but by events that were never fully resolved, places where systems moved on before people could. Some places are haunted because they were never allowed to stop. Pearl Harbor is one of those places, not because the past refuses to leave, but because it was never given the chance. Pearl Harbor was never meant to carry meaning. It was meant to function. That is what ports do. They move ships. They move fuel. They move wars forward. And when war arrives suddenly, violently, without warning, ports are expected to absorb it and continue. Pearl Harbor did exactly that. The ships were repaired. The wrecks were cleared where they interfered. The harbor reopened. The system survived. But systems move faster than people. They restore function before memory has time to settle. They prioritize continuity over closure. They treat silence as efficiency. In Pearl Harbor, loss was not denied. It was postponed. Names were recorded later. Memorials were built later. Acknowledgement came later. But the port itself never stopped long enough to process what had happened beneath it. And so memory lingered in other ways. In the habits of night guards, in the routes workers avoided, in the quiet discomfort that never made it into reports. Not because anyone believed the harbor was alive, but because it had never been allowed to rest. Some places are abandoned after war. They empty out. They fade. Pearl Harbor remained. Active, operational, layered with history it never had time to release. That is what it represents. Not a ghost story, but a reminder that when systems are forced to move on too quickly, the past does not disappear. It settles. The ships were repaired. The harbor reopened. But some who worked there said it never truly went quiet again.